What romantic thing backfired horribly? 3 months ago, I swapped my wife's wedding ring with a $50 replica. Betty's fingers had swollen badly after our daughter was born, and as a result, the band was cutting into her skin and even wearing thin. The ring looked days away from breaking. I carefully slid it off while she slept one night. I gave her the replica next morning and told her I'd had it emergency resized. I expected happiness, but instead her face went pale, almost like I'd exposed some dirty secret. She ran to the bathroom, panicking, repeating no, 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 but then came out 10 minutes later, happier than ever. She told me she was just making sure it hadn't been changed. Her tone seemed way too high-pitched, but I brushed it off as just surprised panic. You see, the whole reason I even did this was because I'd been saving up to get it properly resized, cleaned, and retextured to make it look brand new for our vow renewal in 2 months. For weeks, Betty was thrilled about her resized ring. She kept holding it up to the light, marveling at how the resize and cleaning had restored its sparkle. It looks brand new, she'd tell her sister on FaceTime, like the day Mom gave it to me. She started wearing it to bed again, something she hadn't done since the pregnancy. Posted photos on Instagram, bought a new dress that matched the restored clarity. I should have been relieved, but something nagged at me. The original ring had character, tiny scratches from 40 years on her mother's hand, a warmth to the platinum, a particular fire in the stone. This perfect replica had none of that. Betty should have noticed, and then she did. Does it feel lighter to you? She asked out of the blue. The band seems different. I had to make up an on the spot lie. The next morning, I woke up to her comparing it to old photos, measuring the stone with a ruler against the screen. She started visiting jewelry stores on her lunch breaks, not buying anything, not even getting the ring tested, thank God, just asking questions. How can you tell if a diamond's been replaced? What does resizing do to a stone's structure? Is it normal for an antique ring to suddenly look newer? She'd come home with business cards from appraisers, leave them on the counter, then throw them away the next morning. 2 weeks ago, she downloaded a diamond testing app, then deleted it, then downloaded it again, almost like she was hesitant to get it tested. But then last week, she asked me directly, when you had it resized, you had them do something to it, didn't you? I pretend to not know what she was talking about. She didn't pry further, but when she walked, I caught a sense of satisfaction in her eye, like she was happy she knew I was lying. That's when I decided to rush the process. I scrambled together the money, and the next morning, rushed to the jeweler with the real ring. I handed him the real ring and explained about the vow renewal. He examined it for maybe 30 seconds. Sir, this is a replica. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking, but then he showed me through his loupe, the telltale rainbow reflections, the slight cloudiness at certain angles. It's a good replica, he said, but a replica regardless. My mind started racing. I knew this was the correct ring. I'd compared the two this morning. Their sizes were different. Why was the wedding ring I'd taken off my wife's finger months ago fake? I sat in my car trembling, trying to solve it. Then I realized the only time my wife's ring had ever left her finger was 2 years ago when her brother Mark visited for a week. She'd given it to him to get it cleaned while he was near the jewelry district. That same week, $5,000 had come in and out of Betty's personal account. She said she called the bank, and they confirmed it was a glitch in the system. But was that really true? I sat in the car staring at the fake ring. I knew I needed to confront Betty, but first, I needed to see where this ring went. I drove to every pawn shop within a 2-hour drive, begged every owner to check their entire inventory. When I finally found it, I bought it back on the spot by maxing out every credit card I owned. I drove to the first jeweler I could find, and of course, they confirmed it was real. My mind raced. Back in my car, I searched Betty's texts for Mark's name, spent 3 hours scrolling their entire lifetime of conversation. That's when I found it. 2 years ago, Betty begging, I need $5,000. It's an emergency. Mark asked her to meet up at the coffee shop. Then the next day, Betty, just got the money. Thank you. Please don't tell David about him. Him? I thought to myself, who's him? But my mind knew. You see, right around this time, Betty had a personal trainer, Josh. We had argued a lot about Josh, how he was coming on to her, but she never gave me real reason to suspect her. Then Josh suddenly moved away. Betty seemed indifferent, even told me she was glad he's gone because I don't have to worry anymore. I was convinced nothing happened. But now, when I searched for Josh in her emails, I found a hidden conversation folder. In it, there were pictures, videos of them together, and then his threats to Betty, send me the money, or David sees everything. The dates matched Mark's visit and the text message exchange. That's when I pieced it together. She'd given Mark her wedding ring, he pawned it, then gave her the money to pay Josh off. My stomach dropped. I vomited all over the sidewalk in that car park. Betty knew the ring was fake. You don't wear a fake diamond for 2 years without knowing. That's why she'd been so happy when I swapped it. She thought I'd somehow fixed her problem. That's why she'd been investigating, terrified I'd discovered her secret. I remember sitting in my car, knowing exactly what I had to do the next time I saw her. I started the engine and drove home with the real ring burning a hole in my pocket. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. When I walked through the front door, Betty was stirring something on the stove and looked up with that same smile she'd given me every night for 8 years. Hey honey, dinner's almost ready, she said. I forced my mouth into something that probably looked more like a grimace than a smile. My stomach was doing flips, but I managed to sit down at the table and eat the pasta she'd made. We talked about normal stuff like the baby's doctor appointment next week and whether we needed new tires for her car. The whole time that real ring sat heavy in my pocket while she wore the fake one I'd given her months ago. After dinner, I helped with dishes and we watched some show about home renovations. Betty fell asleep on the couch around 10 like she always did. I carried her to bed and waited another hour to make sure she was really out. Then I went to the garage and opened my old red toolbox that she never touched because she hated getting grease on her hands. I put the real ring in a small plastic bag and buried it under the wrenches and screwdrivers. I took out my phone and laid both rings on the workbench to take pictures. The difference was obvious when you looked close. The real one had this warm glow and tiny scratches that caught the light different. The fake one was too perfect, too shiny, like plastic trying to be glass. The next morning at breakfast, Betty kept playing with the ring while she talked about the vow renewal. I was thinking we could do ivory and gold for the color scheme, she said, holding her hand up so the fake diamond caught the morning sun. Her voice had this excited tone that made my skin crawl now that I knew she'd been wearing a fake for 2 years. She went on about flowers and music choices while I nodded and tried not to stare at that ring. That night after Betty went to yoga class, I sat in the nursery rocking our daughter. She grabbed my finger with with her tiny hand, and I looked down at her innocent face. Whatever happened between Betty and me, this little girl didn't ask for any of it. I made a silent promise that I'd handle everything careful so she wouldn't get hurt. After I put her down, I sat on the couch with my phone and started making a list of everything I needed to do. Get the real ring appraised with official paperwork. Back up all the evidence somewhere safe. Find a lawyer before doing anything stupid. My hands shook as I typed, but having a plan made me feel less like I was drowning. The next morning, Betty left for work and I got busy. I created a new cloud account with a password she'd never guess and started uploading everything. The photos of both rings went in one folder. Screenshots of her texts with Mark went in another. The hidden emails with Josh and his threats got their own folder too. The bank statements showing that $5,000 transfer lined up perfect with the dates. It took 3 hours to organize everything, but I needed it all documented. 2 days later, I drove downtown to a certified appraiser the internet said was the best in the state. The guy examined the real ring for 20 minutes with all kinds of tools and lights. He typed up an official report that confirmed it was authentic and worth $12,000. Then he pointed out something I hadn't noticed. Inside the band was a tiny inscription that said, "For my daughter with eternal love," in cursive so small you needed a magnifying glass to read it. Betty's mom had that engraved when she passed the ring down. My chest got tight thinking about how Betty had pawned something that meant so much to her mother. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with all our bank statements and credit card bills spread out. I went through Betty's texts and emails again, making notes about dates and times. The affair with Josh started 14 months before the blackmail. Their first messages were flirty and got worse from there. By the time Josh threatened her, they'd been together for over a year. Betty paid him the $5,000 exactly 3 days after Mark's visit. Oh wow, the way David discovered all these layers of deception is really interesting. First, thinking he's helping with the ring, then finding out his ring is fake too, then discovering the blackmail. Josh moved away 2 weeks after getting the money. Everything lined up perfect, like pieces of a puzzle I wished I'd never had to solve. The timeline made me sick, but at least I understood what happened. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror trying to practice what I wanted to say to Betty. Every version started calm, but ended with me yelling about betrayal and lies. I tried again and again, but couldn't get through it without my voice cracking or my fists clenching. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and needed more time to prepare. I picked up my phone and texted Mark, asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss family matters. He read it right away, but didn't respond for 2 hours. When he finally wrote back, he said he was really busy with work and maybe we could talk next month. His avoidance told me everything I needed to know about whether he knew I'd figured out their secret. The next morning, I walked over to my neighbor Athena Hodges' house and knocked on her door. She opened it, holding her coffee, and smiled when she saw me standing there. I asked if she could watch our daughter for some appointments I had coming up next week. She said sure and mentioned her fence was falling apart, so I told her I'd fix it next month in exchange. We shook on it, and I walked back feeling weird about making plans for something I wasn't even sure would happen. That night at dinner, Betty was cutting up chicken when she looked at me and asked if everything was okay. I decided to test things and mentioned her ring looked different lately, maybe shinier than before. She immediately started talking fast about how much she loved it and how perfect it would look at our vow renewal. She went on for 5 minutes about flower arrangements and the photographer she wanted to book. Her voice got higher with each sentence, and she kept twisting the ring around her finger. I nodded and ate my food while she talked about centerpieces and whether we should serve fish or beef. The way she kept bringing everything back to the vow renewal made my chest feel tight. After she went to bed, I sat at my laptop and searched for marriage counselors in our area. I found Bennett Hawkins, who had good reviews and specialized in couples dealing with trust issues. I booked an appointment for next week and typed in the notes section that we needed help before our vow renewal. The confirmation email came through right away, and I stared at it, wondering what I was doing. The next morning, I told Betty I'd booked us a couples therapy session to make our relationship stronger before the big day. She looked surprised for a second, then smiled and said that was such a good idea. She hugged me and said she was glad I was taking our marriage so seriously. 2 days later, Bennett's office called for an intake interview, and I took the call in my car during lunch. I told him about finding evidence of betrayal and blackmail without using any names. He listened without interrupting, then said these situations needed careful handling in a safe environment. He asked if there was physical danger, and I said no, but there was a lot of deception involved. He scheduled us for Thursday afternoon and said we'd take things slow. That same day, I left Mark a voicemail saying I knew about the pawn shop and needed to talk. He didn't call back for 3 days, and when he finally did, his voice was defensive right away. He kept saying he didn't know what I was talking about until I mentioned the exact pawn shop address. Then he got quiet and said Betty had begged him for help because she desperately needed money. He said she was crying and scared and wouldn't tell him why she needed it so badly. He admitted taking her ring to the pawn shop and getting $5,000 for it. He said Betty promised to buy it back within a month, but never did. I asked if he knew about Josh, and he said Betty just told him not to tell me about him, but wouldn't say who. Mark sounded tired and said he'd been carrying this guilt for 2 years. The next morning, Betty came home from lunch with a huge smile and receipt in her hand. She'd put down another $1,000 on the vow renewal venue and $500 on catering. She showed me the menu options and kept talking about how perfect everything would be. The deposits were non-refundable, and she'd used our joint savings without asking me first. I felt like I couldn't breathe watching her plan this fake celebration while wearing a fake ring I'd given her. She kept the receipts on the kitchen counter like trophies, and I had to leave the room. I called Gabriella Hartman's law office from my car and made an appointment for Friday afternoon. The secretary asked what type of consultation I needed, and I said family law regarding marriage issues. She told me to bring financial documents and any evidence of marital assets, which felt strange to hear out loud. I hung up and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes just staring at our house. 3 days later, an email came through with the official appraisal document attached as a PDF. I opened it and read through all the technical details about clarity and cut and color. At the bottom was a note about a micro-inscription inside the band that said, "For my daughter with eternal love," in tiny script. The appraiser said this inscription increased the sentimental value and confirmed it was a family heirloom. My eyes got blurry reading about Betty's mom putting that message there for her daughter. I thought about how Betty, Betty had taken something with that inscription and pawned it for cash to pay off her affair partner. I printed the appraisal and put it in a folder with all the other evidence I'd been collecting. That afternoon, I went to the library and created a new email account with a random username and strong password. I forwarded all the evidence there, including screenshots of texts and emails and photos of both rings. I kept thinking Betty might somehow get into my regular email and see what I'd found. Every precaution felt necessary now that I knew how good she was at hiding things. I even cleared my browser history and logged out of everything on our shared computer. Thursday came and we drove to Bennett's office in separate cars since we were both coming from work. The waiting room had soft music and magazines about healthy relationships, which felt like a bad joke. Betty sat next to me, but we didn't talk and she kept checking her phone. Bennett called us in and we sat on opposite ends of his couch while he asked general questions about our relationship. Betty talked about planning our vow renewal and how excited she was while I mentioned feeling distant lately. Neither of us brought up the real problems, and Bennett noticed because he kept asking if there was something specific we wanted to discuss. Betty said everything was basically fine and just needed some small adjustments. I said we had communication issues that needed work before making new vows. Bennett wrote notes and said we were both holding back, but that was normal for a first session. He suggested we think about what we really wanted from therapy before our next appointment. That evening, Betty cornered me in the kitchen while I was loading the dishwasher. She asked if we were okay because I'd seemed distant during therapy. I told her work was stressing me out and she nodded too quickly, clearly relieved I wasn't pushing about other things. The next morning, I drove to Gabriella Hartman's law office downtown for my consultation appointment. She laid out all my options on her desk using printed documents and flowcharts. Legal separation would protect my assets while we figured things out. Temporary custody arrangements would ensure I kept seeing our daughter regularly. The divorce process would take months and cost thousands in legal fees. The reality of potentially ending my marriage hit me like a punch to the stomach. I sat in that leather chair staring at the papers while Gabriella explained community property laws and child support calculations. Following her advice, I left her office and drove straight to a different bank across town. I opened a new checking account in just my name and started moving small amounts from our joint account. The teller handed me the temporary checks without asking why, but her eyes showed she'd seen this before. Back home, I started photographing all our financial documents and uploading them to my secure cloud account. Bank statements, tax returns, investment accounts, mortgage papers, everything Gabriella said I'd need. That afternoon, while Betty was at work, I went through Josh's old gym looking for contact information. The manager remembered him, and after some digging, found his forwarding address and phone number in their files. I sat in my car outside the gym, staring at those digits written on a sticky note. The thought of hearing his voice made my stomach turn, but I needed to know if he was still a threat to my family. Before I could decide what to do, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Josh saying he knew I'd discovered everything, and unless I sent him $5,000 by Friday, he'd send the videos to my entire family. My hands shook as I screenshot the message, and then another one that came right after with more threats. He'd somehow found out I knew about the affair and was trying to squeeze more money from us. I immediately forwarded everything to Gabriella, who called me within 10 minutes. She told me not to pay him under any circumstances and to document every single contact attempt. This was criminal extortion, and we needed to build a case properly. Having legal backing helped me resist the urge to drive to his address and confront him directly. 2 days later, Mark called while I was at work saying he needed to talk to me about something important. He admitted he still had the original pawn shop receipt from 2 years ago tucked in his wallet. He offered to give it to me as evidence because he was tired of keeping Betty's secrets and lying to me. I wonder why Josh picked right now to start threatening David. Did someone tell him David was investigating? The timing is so specific. Right after David got Josh's contact info from the gym. How did Josh even know David had figured things out? We arranged to meet that afternoon in a grocery store parking lot near his apartment. He pulled up next to my car and handed me the yellowed receipt through his window. The dates matched perfectly with Betty's text messages, and the $5,000 amount was circled in red ink. Seeing physical proof of the timeline written on that crumpled paper made everything undeniably real. Mark apologized for his part in it all and said Betty had begged him not to tell me. He drove off quickly without making eye contact, and I sat there holding the receipt like it might disappear. That night, after putting our daughter to bed, I walked past our bedroom and heard Betty on FaceTime with her sister. She was gushing about how amazing the ring looked after its resize and how the clarity was completely restored. Her performance was so convincing, I wondered how many other lies I'd believed over the years. She held the fake ring up to her phone camera, and her sister complimented how sparkly it looked now. Betty laughed and said it was like having Mom's ring brand new again, which made my chest tight with anger. After she hung up, I went to my home office and opened my laptop to write an email. I typed Betty's mother's email address, even though she'd been dead for 3 years now. Writing to her helped me process what Betty had done to her memory and her precious gift. I wrote about finding the real ring in a pawn shop and how Betty had sold it to pay off her affair partner. I wrote about the inscription inside the band that said, "For my daughter, with eternal love," and how that made the betrayal worse. I wrote about the fake ring Betty was wearing and pretending to cherish while knowing it wasn't real. I saved the draft without sending it, but somehow putting those words down helped me breathe a little easier. The next few days passed in a blur of secret preparations and careful acting around Betty. I kept adding documents to my evidence folder and meeting with Gabriella to plan our next steps. Josh sent 2 more threatening texts, which I screenshot and forwarded to both Gabriella and the police. Betty kept planning our vow renewal, booking vendors and sending me links to venues, completely unaware of what was coming. Our second therapy session with Bennett was 3 days later, and I knew I had to say something. I sat on the couch next to Betty while she talked about wedding venues and guest lists like nothing was wrong. Bennett asked how we were handling stress with the vow renewal coming up, and that's when I said it. I told him someone was blackmailing Betty, and she needed to come clean about what happened 2 years ago. Her whole body went stiff next to me, and her face turned white as paper. She started shaking her head and saying, I didn't know what I was talking about, but Bennett held up his hand. He said we should slow down and explore this safely without accusations. Betty's hands were shaking, and she kept looking at the door like she wanted to run. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, telling them I had proof of everything. Betty stood stood up so fast the coffee table shook and walked straight out of the session without saying a word. The door slammed behind her, and Bennett asked if I wanted to continue alone for the rest of our time. We spent the next 40 minutes talking about how to handle this without making things worse for our daughter. He kept writing notes and asking about safety concerns with the blackmailer still active. That evening, while I was giving our daughter a bath, my phone rang, and it was Bennett. He said he'd been thinking about our situation and wanted to suggest a structured confrontation with ground rules. He offered to mediate if Betty would agree because this needed to happen in a controlled environment. I told him I'd think about it, but I already knew this was the only safe way forward. The next morning, I called Gabriella from my car outside work to update her on everything. She pulled up our file and started outlining what a temporary separation agreement would look like. She kept emphasizing that keeping things stable for our daughter had to be the top priority no matter what. She emailed me draft paperwork that covered living arrangements, custody schedules, and financial responsibilities. Reading through it made my stomach hurt, but I knew we needed a plan before everything exploded. That afternoon, I sat in my car during lunch and texted Mark about what was coming. I asked if he'd be willing to attend a meeting as a witness to explain what really happened 2 years ago. He didn't respond for 2 hours, and when he finally did, he just said he owed me that much for his part in the deception. I told him I'd let him know when and where, but I already had a place in mind. I drove past the coffee shop where Mark had met Betty 2 years ago to give her the pawn money. The same wooden tables were still outside, and the same faded awning hung over the entrance. This felt like the right place to finally address what started there. I made a reservation for their back room, which they used for small meetings, and paid in advance. 3 days later, I was sitting in my car 30 minutes before the meeting time when my phone buzzed. Josh had sent me a new video clip of him and Betty together, with a message saying I better remember what's at stake. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped the phone, but I managed to forward it straight to Gabriella and then to the police. I added it to the case file number they'd given me, even though they said these cases rarely went anywhere. Mark's truck pulled up 20 minutes early, and he walked over to my car looking nervous. He saw how rattled I was and asked what was wrong, so I showed him Josh's latest threat. He said maybe I should just pay Josh again to make this go away, but I told him the extortion had to stop. He nodded, and we walked into the coffee shop together to wait in the back room. The wooden chair creaked when I sat down, and I pulled out the real ring, the appraisal paperwork, and the pawn shop receipt. I arranged them carefully on the scratch table and checked my phone every few seconds. Betty walked in exactly on time wearing sunglasses, even though it was cloudy outside. She froze when she saw Mark sitting there, and then her eyes went to the items on the table. Her face crumbled like a house of cards, and she sank into the chair across from me. She started to speak, but I held up my hand for silence because I needed to say something first. I told her I knew everything about the ring, about Josh, about the blackmail, and about Mark helping her pawn it. Her mouth opened and closed, like she was trying to find words, but nothing came out. She finally whispered that yes, she pawned the ring to pay Josh, but it wasn't what I thought. I pulled up the screenshots of their messages on my phone and turned it toward her. The denial drained from her face like water from a bathtub, and she took off her sunglasses with shaking hands. She looked at Mark, who wouldn't meet her eyes, and then back at me. She said Josh had threatened to ruin our family if she didn't pay him, and she panicked. She admitted they'd been together multiple times when I was traveling for work, and he had videos of everything. She said he contacted her out of nowhere 2 years ago, demanding money, or he'd send everything to me and my family. She was crying now, and her mascara was running down her cheeks in black streams. She said she knew the ring was her mom's most precious gift, but she didn't know what else to do. She thought if she paid him once he'd go away, but he kept coming back for more until she cut him off. She said that's why she was so scared when I swapped the rings because she thought I'd found out everything. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to our bank app, showing her I already knew about the joint accounts. Her hands shook as she opened her purse and pulled out 2 credit cards I'd never seen before. She admitted she'd opened them 6 months ago to pay for groceries and gas while sending cash to Josh. The first card had $8,000 maxed out and the second had $5,000. My chest got tight seeing the statement she pulled up on her phone. All those times she said she was using coupons or finding deals, she was actually drowning us in debt. Mark shifted in his chair and said he didn't know about the cards either. Betty kept wiping her eyes with napkins from the dispenser while explaining how Josh kept asking for more money every few months. I told her I wanted us to separate while we figured out how to handle our daughter. She nodded and didn't even try to argue because we both knew there was nothing left to save. I called Gabriella and put her on speaker right there in the coffee shop. She outlined what we needed to do immediately, including Betty finding somewhere else to stay for a few days while I stayed with the baby. Betty agreed to everything Gabriella said without any pushback. Gabriella said she'd email us both a temporary custody schedule and reminded us to document everything for the court. When we got home that evening, I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started packing my clothes from our bedroom. Betty sat on the bed watching me move hangers and fold shirts into neat piles. I carried everything to the guest room down the hall and set up my phone charger on the nightstand. We worked out a schedule where she'd handle the 2 a.m. feeding and I'd take the 5 a.m. one. The baby monitor sat between our rooms like a bridge between 2 different worlds. Neither of us slept much that first night apart. The next morning, while Betty was at work, I drove to the cemetery with the real ring in my pocket. The groundskeeper was trimming hedges near the entrance when I explained what I needed. He said he could put it in the vault with Betty's mother during his afternoon rounds. I handed him the ring in its original velvet box along with a $20 tip. Sitting in my car afterward, I cried harder than I had in years. Why did the groundskeeper agree to put the ring in the vault so easily? That seems like such an unusual request, but he just said yes right away. Makes me wonder if people ask for things like this more often than we'd think at cemeteries. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark saying he was sorry for his part in everything. He wrote 3 paragraphs about being scared of what the family would think if he didn't help his sister. He asked if I could forgive him someday, but understood if I couldn't. I texted back that I needed time to process everything before I could even think about forgiveness. That afternoon, I drove to the police station with a folder full of printed screenshots and bank statements. The officer at the desk gave me forms to fill out for extortion and blackmail charges against Josh. She looked through my evidence and said, "These cases rarely go anywhere," but took everything for the detective. I got a case number, and and she said someone would call me within a week. Betty's sister called that night asking why we canceled the venue for the vow renewal. I told her we were having some personal issues and needed to postpone indefinitely. She kept pressing for details, but I stayed vague and got off the phone quickly. Over the next few days, more family members reached out with questions and concerns. Some had already heard rumors from Mark or Betty's sister. The gossip spread through our friend group too. When Betty changed her relationship status on social media, people started choosing sides without knowing the full story. I met with a financial advisor at my credit union to figure out the mess with the maxed cards. He spread out all the statements and calculated it would take 24 months to pay everything off if I made double payments. The ring alone had cost me $12,000 across 4 different cards. He helped me set up a payment plan and consolidate some of the debt. Every month for the next 2 years, I'd be paying for Betty's lies. 3 weeks later, we had our first official mediation session at Gabriella's office. Betty brought her own lawyer, and we sat at opposite ends of a long conference table. The mediator went through each item on the custody agreement line by line. We agreed on alternating weekends and splitting holidays down the middle. When it came to the house, Betty said she'd move in with her sister temporarily. We divided the monthly bills like business partners reviewing a contract. She'd pay the car payment and insurance while I covered the mortgage and utilities. The mediator typed everything up and printed 2 copies for us to sign. Betty's hand shook as she wrote her name at the bottom of each page. We scheduled another session for the following month to review how things were going. Walking out to our separate cars felt like the end of something neither of us wanted to name. Bennett scheduled us for the next week, and we sat on opposite ends of his couch while he laid out ground rules for co-parenting during separation. He pulled out a whiteboard and drew 2 houses with a little stick figure child between them, explaining how kids absorb conflict even when parents think they're hiding it. Betty nodded and took notes while I watched her pen move across the paper, both of us agreeing our daughter came first, no matter what happened between us. The session focused on practical stuff like pickup times and who handles doctor appointments and how to keep our problems away from her bedtime stories. I found the apartment listing that afternoon on my phone while sitting in the parking lot, a 1-bedroom place 6 blocks from the house that had month-to-month terms. The landlord met me there an hour later, and I signed the lease on his clipboard while standing in the empty living room that smelled like fresh paint. I moved in over 3 trips with my truck, taking just my clothes and some kitchen basics and the old TV from the garage. That first night, I lay on the air mattress listening to sirens instead of baby monitors, the walls too quiet without the sounds of Betty getting up for water or our daughter stirring in her crib. The relief of not pretending everything was fine mixed with the weird emptiness of being alone for the first time in years. Gabriella called me 2 days later while I was eating cereal from a paper bowl in my empty kitchen. She asked if I was ready to file the divorce papers or if I wanted to wait and see if we could work things out. I told her I needed more time to figure out what would be best for our daughter in the long run, not just what would make me feel better right now. She said that was smart and reminded me there was no rush to make permanent decisions while emotions were still raw. My phone buzzed that night with an email from Betty that went on for 6 paragraphs, mixing apologies with explanations about Josh's threats and how trapped she felt when he started demanding money. She wrote about being scared of losing me and our daughter and how the affair was the biggest mistake of her life, but she couldn't undo it once Josh had the evidence. I read through it twice, seeing how she kept shifting between taking blame and making excuses, then moved it to a folder without typing any response. The next morning, I met with Gabriella at her office, and we wrote up a list of conditions for any possible reconciliation on her yellow legal pad. Full financial transparency, with shared access to all accounts, 0 contact with Josh forever, individual therapy for Betty to work through whatever led to the affair, and marriage counseling for both of us if we decided to try again. She helped me figure out boundaries that would protect both me and our daughter from more lies, typing them up in a document she said I could share with Betty when I was ready. We called the venue that afternoon and officially canceled the vow renewal, losing the $3,000 deposit we'd put down 6 months ago. The manager sounded disappointed when I said we had personal issues to work through, and I heard her typing notes about keeping our deposit while I stared at the fake plant in Gabriella's waiting room. Betty texted me that her family kept asking what happened, and she didn't know what to tell them, so we agreed on saying we were working through some challenges and needed privacy. I spent that evening at my apartment going through every social media account and blocking Josh on each platform, then changing all my passwords to random strings of numbers I wrote in a notebook. The evidence folder stayed backed up in 3 different cloud services, even though the detective who finally called said these blackmail cases rarely lead to prosecution, but to keep documenting any contact attempts just in case. He took Josh's information and said they'd add it to their database, but not to expect much action unless Josh tried something again. Tonight, I'm sitting at my tiny kitchen table with the custody calendar spread out next to an empty ring box I can't bring myself to throw away. The real ring is back with Betty's mom where it belongs, and the fake one sits in my desk drawer like evidence of how complicated everything got. I know Betty and I might not make it through this mess we've created. The trust is gone, and maybe it won't come back no matter how much therapy we do or how many conditions we set. But our daughter will be okay because I'll make sure of it, even if that means accepting that our family will look different from we planned, messier and more complicated, but still held together by the love we both have for her. Thanks for hanging out with me and exploring all these questions today. I had a lot of fun wondering about everything with you. Catch you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.